Okay, so here we are again. For this class, we're going to be going over the idea of American values and what that means. Are American value, to what extent can you even say that American values exist? And as well as the idea of how do you, assimilate immigrants into American culture and the sort of ongoing, struggle over that. Um, so I selected readings by the writers Randolph Bourne and G.K. Chesterton, who I think have some interesting takes on that. Particularly to the extent that, do American values even really exist, or is it more just kind of sort of like a sort of like mishmash of different cultures? I think they have some sort of interesting takes on that. I'll try to keep this class a little bit short and sweet. I know last class was a little bit longer. And next class, I might have some more things to say about the Constitution. So I'm going to try to run through this one pretty quickly as well. But Bourne and Chesterton are basically, writing during roughly the same period of time. Bourne is American. Chesterton is British. Chesterton's writing comes from the 1920s, from his book, What I Saw in America. Bourne's essay, Transnational America, is written in 1916, while World War I is still going on, and basically in the year or so, leading up to the war. So, I mean, that's obviously important. And it kind of serves as a nice segue from what I was talking about last class, because I focused on a lot of the Supreme Court cases of this era, and the really massive crackdown on dissent, repression of dissent during World War I, particularly among socialists and anarchists and basically people on the left. And in the article I wrote, I talk about this immense double standard that you can see throughout American history to crack down more on the left and on the right. You could see that today, obviously, but you could see that back then as well. I mean, during this period of time, the KKK was arguably at the peak of its power, and they were doing all sorts of horrible things, lynchings, things like that, and largely acting with impunity, basically being able to, more or less do what they want. At the same time, if you were a socialist or an anarchist, you were, thrown in jail, beaten by the police, deported from the country. In most cases, simply for just handing out flyers and pamphlets, basically, opposing the war or opposing American capitalism or capitalism in general. For example, one of the defendants in the Abrams case, which I talk about in the article, didn't talk about as much in class, was beaten so badly by the police that he basically died from his injuries before he could stand trial. Again, these people were not engaged in violent actions or terrorist acts or anything like that. So you can see a tremendous sort of effort to come down on the left in this country, which in those days was mostly made up of socialists and anarchists, as well as some progressive reformers as well. And I think Bourne sort of comes out of that. I mean, Bourne sort of comes out of the progressive era. This attempt, a very important moment in American history. This attempt to sort of reform aspects of the American government to deal with the the concentration of wealth, the growth of corporate power and things like that, things which had not even really existed during the founding of the Constitution. And I think that's a very important thing that people often overlook when they talk about American politics today. I mean this idea of limiting power, limited government, and things like that, using the power of the government to curb sort of certain economic excesses and things like that. It's a controversial issue in the United States, at least. It's important to keep in mind though that these sort of massive corporate conglomerates that we talk about today, I mean, didn't even really exist back then. I mean, there was almost nothing equivalent to these massive corporations that you see today. And the progressives were largely reacting to that and trying to essentially adapt American institutions to deal with those things better, and as well as trying to make the American government more democratic. So you see probably the culmination of that, of course, is women gaining the right to vote, allowing for the direct election of senators. I mean, we'll talk about this more when we talk about the Constitution, the various constitutional amendments. The progressives also introduced the first, sort of regular income tax. Since the Civil War, which is kind of like a temporary measure, basically a temporary wartime measure to raise, revenue. The income tax becomes, a regular thing after 1913, and all sort of things, emanating from the progressive movement. The importance of primaries in the selection of presidential candidates becomes sort of a norm during this time as well. And I would say, like, ultimately, the progressive reforms, failed at dealing with a lot of the problems that they were trying to address, but they, made some important contributions. And, again, a lot of these legacies are still with us today. Now, again, as far as World War I goes, I mean, that's a very interesting thing. World War I often gets overlooked, I think, by World War II, probably because World War II was a much bigger war. World War II, of course, was just, catastrophic at the time, the largest war that people had ever seen. World War II there's much more, archival footage of the war that probably plays a reason for it as well. But I think also, the motivations behind the war. It's probably, one of the closest examples you can find to, seeing, if not clear-cut good guys in the conflict, at least clear-cut bad guys. The fight against Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. I mean, there's just no way to defend either of those governments. Particularly the Nazis. Not to understate the atrocities committed by Imperial Japan back then as well. World War I is much more ambiguous in that extent. And I was listening to something recently, a political podcast recently, and one of the people brought up the point that, which I think is a good point, that if you want to see a good sort of example of how sort of ideology sort of seeps into our education system, and things like that, to put it in cruder terms, how people are, essentially brainwashed, as I've said before. I mean, look to how your sort of standard American history textbook explains World War I, American involvement in the war, and even, the outbreak of the war itself. I mean, and I don't, by the way, intend on, really, explaining either of these things in great detail, because there are other things I want to talk about. And like I said, I want to keep this class short. But I mean, the generally standard reason for why, what even led to the outbreak of war in the first place is supposedly because of nationalism, right? Particularly in Serbian nationalism. The assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the sort of, multi-ethnic conglomeration of different states that existed in Central and Eastern Europe. That they were, there were all these like nationalist movements that wanted to become independent of this empire, and things just sort of escalated out of control, and all these sort of competing nationalisms, French nationalism, German nationalism, British, and so on and so forth. They all just got very upset at each other and fought this catastrophic war, like I said, that led to something like 14 million deaths or something like that. And of course, that's not to say it's not true at all, but I mean, it drastically oversimplifies and really conceals, sort of underlying tensions, right? And what you see, of course, is that leading up to the First World War, is you see this development of these sort of competing imperialist powers, which in turn were sort of, built up through the greater concentration of, industrial and industrial capital and bank capitals, forming these massive monopolies, these large corporate entities, which again, prior to this did not really exist. And they tended to have, great influence over the government. I mean, many Marxist theorists back then, including, like Lenin and Bukharin and certain leaders of the Russian Revolution, would argue that these corporate monopolies essentially control the national governments, whether it was in Britain or France or et cetera, or Germany. I think they probably exaggerate that a little bit. I think there were always sort of conflicts between different elements of the capitalist classes, but nonetheless, I mean, there was certainly a greater sort of concentration of corporate power, to an extent that did not really, exist prior to that. And then these corporations certainly had a big influence over the governments, particularly in their policies of colonial expansion and exporting capital overseas and trying to gobble up resources and find markets and invest capital in overseas markets. And again, the reasons for that are fairly complex. But that is rarely talked about at all. I mean this idea that the war was essentially brought on by this increasing conflict between imperialist powers is really talked about at all. If you want to find a fairly good explanation for it, I would look at the essay by Nikolai Bukharin, one of the leaders of the Russian Revolution. What's it called? Imperialism in the World Economy. I believe that's the title. Lenin is much more well known for an essay he wrote, or a pamphlet he wrote, called Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, back then. But I would argue that Bukharin's essay is a little more theoretical, a little more thought out. Lenin's is a little more simplified, which to be fair, he acknowledges the fact that he's essentially writing a pamphlet. He's not trying to write this great theoretical work explaining imperialism. And I'm not saying that there aren't any, limitations to their analysis. Like I said, probably overemphasizing the sort of fusion of state power with corporate power, where I think there were probably still differences between different, factions of the capitalist classes that existed back then. But it provides a pretty good, understanding of what really led up to the war. Again, this sort of great competition between imperialist powers. Now, imperialism itself had been developing basically since the late 19th century. People, again, often are not aware of the fact that the Great Depression was first used to talk about the massive economic recession that happens in 1873. It basically lasts for almost like 20 years afterwards. At the time, the worst economic recession in history. And one of the longest, one of the longest prolonged periods of depression ever. And obviously when we talk about the Great Depression, we're talking about what happened in the late 1920s through the 1930s. But that term was originally first used for this period of time. So the argument goes essentially is because as, again, profits were falling in these European, empires, basically. The British Empire had already, fairly been built up by this period of time. And the other European powers were following. The French were already there. The Germans get into it a little bit later because Germany doesn't become really a unified state until the late 19th century. But because of the prolonged economic depression in these countries, it creates a motivation to, again, find different avenues of creating profits, and that leads them to colonial expansion. Again, trying to find new sources of investment overseas, building up industries overseas and things like that. So a lot of people would argue that the drive towards greater imperialism was, of course, created by, again, the periodic crises that are created by the capitalist system, which I spent a little time talking about last class, and maybe I'll talk about again in the future. Suffice to say, again, I mean, these are complicated things that I can't really go that much into detail about. But the idea that World War I was created by this sort of imperialistic rivalry between different competing imperial powers is rarely ever talked about, if at all, in any sort of standard American history textbook, even among things a little more advanced. I mean, even more academic writings about the outbreak of the war tend to put a much greater emphasis on nationalism and things like that, and don't look at the what motivated imperialism in the first place, being sort of a reaction to a massive economic depression that occurred in the late 19th century, and the sort of competition among different imperial powers to essentially gobble up the rest of the world. To establish colonies, or at least some kind of imperial dominion over other countries. One of the liberal critics of imperialism, J.A. Hobson, who's not a Marxist but had a great influence on Lenin, talks a lot about this, in fact, and talks about the so-called scramble for Africa that you see in the late 19th century. Again, all these European powers trying very aggressively to sort of gobble up large territories, large tracts of territory in Africa in order to have control over the resources there. Africa being a very, resource rich, continent in the world, although, different resources in different parts, obviously, to have a market for exports and things like that. There are different arguments for imperialism. I mean, Hobson's analysis is probably not the best one. Other theorists probably have a better understanding of it. The sort of argument over underconsumption in the home country versus the falling rate of profit is kind of an argument that debates a lot of that splits a lot of Marxist theorists. I'm more inclined to the falling rate of profit notion than the idea of so-called underconsumption. But that's again, like I said, a fairly complicated issue that I won't go into right now. Since I mentioned it, I mean the shorthand explanation for it is that the idea that because monopolies become so powerful in the home countries like Britain and France and things like that, that they depress wages. Workers are literally too poor to buy, a good amount of the products, or all the products basically that are produced during a given period of time. And so to offset that, capitalists have to then sort of find new areas of consumption, basically export capital to different parts of the world. There's something to be said about that, but there are sort of flaws in that argument as well. For one, they probably place too much of an emphasis on consumer demand. They often forget that capitalists themselves are consumers, and that their consumption and their need to create new means of production and things like that can often serve as a form of demand as well. And I would argue probably what makes better sense is the idea that the profit rate again starts to fall in these countries, and they then try to find basically higher return on their investments through imperial expansion. Anyway, like I said, very complicated issue, and I'm probably not doing justice to the argument there. But that's something that you rarely ever hear about. Now, as far as the U.S. involvement in the war, here again, I mean, you hear, if anything, possibly even more absurd in that you hear things. Well, the U.S. got involved in the war to make the world safe for democracy, which of course is what Woodrow Wilson said after repeatedly promising that he was going to keep us out of the war. People talk about things like the sinking of the Lusitania, the Zimmerman telegram, the Germans trying to rile up Mexico to go to war with the United States. I mean, these explanations for the U.S. involvement in the war are really absurd. The Lusitania sank in 1915, 2 years before the U.S. gets involved in the war. The idea that the Americans were significantly worried about, a Mexican invasion of the United States is also fairly absurd as well. But those are, again, the sort of standard reasons that were given for why this war, why the U.S. got involved in the war. And I would say a much better explanation comes from the fact that, again, simply put, the United States had loaned significant amounts of money, in fact, to all of the, contestants in the war on both sides, but much more so to the so-called Allied powers, the British and the French in particular, especially the British. I mean, to the sum of billions of dollars, which in those days is actually a lot of money. And I think there was a real fear that if the U.S. had, if the British and the French had lost the war, that the U.S. may not get their loans paid back. And of course, after the war, the U.S. did insist on repayments of its war debt, which many scholars now would argue had a very negative impact on the sort of the post-war world. That and the massive reparations payments, which were saddled on Germany, played a very big role, in contributing to the sort of the breakdown of the system. The Great Depression didn't help either, obviously. But basically sort of, laid the seeds for a future world war, which would, come about only about 20 years later after the end of the First War. And that the sort of chain of events were essentially set in motion by basically the bad choices essentially made by the Americans and the victorious Allied powers after the war. So again, you rarely ever hear about that. You rarely ever hear about, you know, the massive, you know, debts that the Allies were incurring towards the Americans, the fear that the American, you know, bankers, people like, you know, J.P. Morgan, people like that would not get their loans paid back. So that pretty much led to the U.S. involvement in the war. The war was also a good occasion, provided a good opportunity to really, you know, again, crack down on the left, which we've already talked about, and you see this reflected in several of the Supreme Court cases of this era. Again, these sort of so-called landmark free speech cases, where you start to realize how bad, you know, the actual record of the courts are in protecting freedom of speech. And I wonder to what extent that was a motivation as well. That because, you know, prior to this, you know, socialism was kind of on the rise. You know, not just in the United States, but throughout the world had been gaining, you know, momentum basically since the late 19th century. Again, owing in large part to the, you know, unstable, volatile economic conditions, but also to the increasing, you know, organization of socialist movements. Probably none more so than the German Social Democratic Party, which was sort of like the model of a socialist party back then. When the war came, you know, unfortunately, the Social Democratic Party, through its support, you know, sort of abandoned its commitment to socialism and sort of threw its support in with the, you know, nationalist imperialist war effort on the part of the German government. But in the U.S. as well, though not as extensive as you would see in Europe, you know, socialism was gaining steam. You had Eugene Debs, who ran for president, you know, I think 5 times during this period of time, each time I think gaining more votes than he had in the previous time. I think his 2 strongest showings were actually in 1912, where I think I believe he won a higher percentage of the popular vote, and you know, close to 1 million votes overall. And then in 1920, where he again won, I think, more votes, and again even closer to about, you know, 1 million votes or so, but maybe a slightly smaller percentage of the popular vote, although I could be wrong about that. But famously, you know, his campaign from 1920, he ran from a jail cell. And again, I talked about that in the article as well. One of the, you know, again, important Supreme Court cases of this era, Debs versus the United States, where the Supreme Court, including the liberals on the court, like Brandeis and Holmes, unanimously voted to, you know, uphold the conviction against Debs and basically throw him in jail, where he literally ran a presidential campaign from prison. And again, won, you know, about 1 million votes. So had a pretty good showing during that period of time. But even prior to that, prior to the war, like I said, you know, socialism had been sort of gaining steam. There were various, you know, sort of competing theories about socialism. Is socialism going to come about through a revolution? Are we going to sort of evolve into socialism through reforms that had kind of become more of the sort of the policy of the German Social Democratic Party, and, you know, other socialist parties as well. So that idea was certainly, you know, gaining importance. And I think, you know, many people were starting to, even people outside of the socialist movement, were starting to come around to the fact that maybe socialism is an inevitable thing. And so what the war did, though, both in Europe and also in the United States, is it essentially crushed the growing socialist movements. It like I said, in Europe, many of the socialist parties, you know, threw in their support with the national governments. In the United States, it provided an opportunity for a massive, you know, crackdown against socialism in the United States as well. You know, the first of many, you know, periods of repression. You know, the first so-called Red Scare happens during this period of time, and even after World War I, after the Russian Revolution. Of course, we'd hear about this again with McCarthyism and things like that in the 1950s. And I mean, that has been, I would say, a pretty, you know, recurring thread throughout American history, this massive repression of the left, particularly the socialist left. Anyway, so Bourne is sort of writing in this context. This is all sort of, you know, to contextualize what Bourne is talking about here. And you know, Bourne, to his credit, I would say, was one of the few progressive thinkers who was opposed to the war. And again, most of the progressive, despite the reforms that they may have made, basically most of them supported the war, including, of course, Wilson. But many of the progressive intellectuals of that era as well. And I would say it's to Bourne, it's to Bourne's credit that he was basically opposed to the war. And a lot of his, more well-known writings deal with that topic as well. But in this case, we're dealing with this idea of what he calls transnational America. So what does that term mean, basically? First of all, I would say the term transnationalism, has never really caught on, I guess. But I would say essentially what Bourne is talking about is today what we'd basically call multiculturalism. The idea that sort of different ethnic groups should be allowed to preserve their own ethnic identities and customs, but within certain limitations. Maybe Bourne would, I would say is not probably entirely without some kind of, Eurocentric bias either, but so it was much more, I think, open-minded than most other, American elites during this period of time. And he's very critical of this idea to sort of, assimilate people into the so-called American culture, which he refers to as the tasteless, colorless fluid of humanity. Or again, the sort of like bland, sterile, American culture, derived from the Puritans and the Anglo-Saxons, the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. And I think there's a lot, there's a lot to that. And I think, we still see this, issue going on now, and it may not be so much, forcing people to adopt to, puritanical values. But to the extent that there's an American culture at all, I mean, it's largely identified with consumerism, right? I mean, it's about, eating McDonald's and wearing Nike shoes and things like that. And, having an iPhone or something like that. It sort of even does a disservice to the word, culture, to refer to it as a culture. I mean, it's basically just sort of rampant consumerism, which of course, again, is necessary in a capitalist system to maintain, profits. People need to consume a lot. And so we sort of encourage people and sort of, incentivize people to consume vast amounts. And I would say, we see this even today as well. I mean, many immigrants who come to the United States, assimilate into this, very sort of, empty, consumer culture, quote unquote culture that exists here within the United States. And again, Bourne was writing this article shortly before the U.S. joined the war. Now, again, another aspect of it, besides the crackdown against socialists and anarchists, was this sort of crackdown on so-called hyphenated Americans. Hyphenated Americans would be sort of like not pure Americans, right? But you're Italian Americans, right? It's Italian hyphen American. You're Polish Americans and different ethnic groups like that. This idea that the hyphenated Americans were again not the pure Americans. I think this is also probably fueled by the fact that, to a large extent, socialists and anarchists were perceived as being, foreign influences, whether they were from Germany or from Russia or other countries in Europe. This idea that we're letting in all these, foreigners that have all these, subversive ideas and things like that, and something has to be done about it. So again, I already mentioned that Wilson, basically lied about the war, lied about, getting the U.S. involved in the war. The war, if you don't know, begins in 1914. Bourne is writing this essay in 1916. The U.S. gets involved in the war in 1917, and then it ends the following year. And now, again, it's also a very debatable question: to what extent did the U.S. coming into the war really change the outcome of it? Of course, the standard American view, of course, is that we helped, tip the scales in favor of the Allied powers. Many people would argue that the Germans were already basically beaten by the time that the U.S. got involved in the war. So the U.S. involvement in the war, in that case, again, played very little role in changing the outcome of the war, but did play a big role, again, in sort of, cracking down on dissent within the United States. So this is an image of Wilson's re-election campaign from 1916. And you can see this is how they did it, the days before social media and things like that. They would drive around in these trucks with all these, sort of posters and advertisements for what the candidate stands for. And of course, this is a very sort of, this doesn't lend itself to sustained intellectual discourse and debate over political issues, you get a very sort of, condensed version of what the candidates stand for. And I mean, that's worth pointing out as well, right? There's a period of time where, advertising is starting to take place. I mean, many people point to Edward Bernays, who was a nephew of Sigmund Freud, or had some distant relation to him, the founder of public relations, who played a very big role in the American war propaganda efforts during this period of time. But already you can see, even prior to this, you can see the sort of, increasing movement towards advertising and sensationalism and things like that. Anyway, one of the things that Wilson is campaigning on is, as it says, who keeps us out of war, meaning vote for Wilson because he's the candidate that's going to keep us out of the war. And this is in 1916, and it's already known now that behind the scenes Wilson had already sort of come around to the idea that the U.S. is going to have to get involved in the war. So, pretty notorious example of lying to the public. Certainly not the first time or last time that a presidential candidate has done that. I won't go into all the campaign promises made by Biden that he has not followed. Least of which was that he was going to get rid of COVID and things like that, and that obviously has not happened. Now they're just sort of resigned to the fact that the virus is going to spread and there's nothing they can do about it. But Wilson, is campaigning on the idea that the U.S. is going to remain neutral during the war, while behind the scenes, like I said, they had already realized that the U.S. was going to get involved, but still, ran on the idea of neutrality anyway. And just to emphasize that even more, you can see this idea of, who, keeping us out of the war was a very big part of the Wilson campaign in 1916. And you can see, Wilson wins a pretty decisive victory. Well, I mean, it's actually fairly close, but in terms of the Electoral College, I think even close in terms of the popular vote. So I'll take that back. It was not a decisive victory. It was actually a fairly close election. It looks like, when you look at the colors on the map, it looks like a more decisive victory for Wilson because of the states that he picked up. But the election was actually a bit closer than that. But both candidates were basically running on the idea of neutrality as well. It's not as if Hughes, the Republican candidate, was this warmonger either. And I'll talk about this more when we deal with the Electoral College later on. But it's interesting to notice the sort of changing electoral vote totals from a lot of these states. States like New York and Pennsylvania have lost a lot of electoral votes, given changes in the demographics and population of the United States. Look at states like California, only 13 electoral votes. Again, the electoral votes are tied to the population of the states. So the greater the population, the more electoral votes that you get. States like California and Texas and Florida, very low votes during this period of time, and of course that would change basically after World War II, and continue to increase even to the present day. Here's an image again of a cartoon basically of Eugene Debs running from his jail cell in 1920. Wilson in particular apparently had a lot of animosity towards Debs, and there was a bit of a public backlash against this. I mean, here you see clearly an elderly old man. If this cartoon's a little too disarming, I mean, here you actually see Debs's mugshot. I mean, clearly you can see he's a much elderly man. He was not a despised public figure. I mean, I think most people, Debs, again, being the leader of the Socialist Party, a well-known labor activist and organizer, was not a hated figure in the American public. As you can see, quite elderly at this point. To throw a person like this in jail, again, for not committing any violent actions or anything like that, did actually cause a bit of a public backlash. But Wilson was quite adamant in refusing any pleas to pardon Debs. In fact, it would not be until the Republican Warren G. Harding administration takes office that Debs would receive a pardon. And I believe he died within 2 or 3 years or so after that. And without any doubt that his stay in prison, the adverse conditions there probably had a very negative impact on his health. And so again, another thing that stands about World War I are the massive propaganda efforts. So alongside, and these things very much go hand in hand with the crackdown and repression of people on the left. So you're suppressing dissenting voices and subversive voices, and at the same time just relentlessly bombarding people with all these sort of patriotic messages and things like that. And you can see a lot of these things are fairly, I mean, they're probably more graphic examples. You can see a little, blood on the bayonet and on the fingers in the center image. Beat back the Hun, destroy this mad brute with the little German helmet with the pointy, the point coming out of it. There was a real attempt to really sort of, demonize Germany in America at this point in time. Famously, sauerkraut was renamed Liberty cabbage. Frankfurters or hot dogs are basically renamed Liberty sausage and things like that. It sounds stupid, and it is. Of course, this would be, sort of redone by the Bush administration against France when France did not support the invasion of Iraq. 2003, French fries were named Freedom Fries, and French toast was named freedom toast. I don't know if they changed French kissing to freedom kissing or anything like that, but I mean, these kinds of things are dumb, but possibly effective. Unfortunately, as simple as they may seem, that probably had some impact, at least on the public, and sort of, again, brainwashing people to support the war, just as most of the American public, at least initially, supported the invasion of Iraq as well. Here's some more examples of it, so sort of playing to a different, kind of a different tone, right? Where these are very sort of foreboding, disturbing images. This is sort of playing to a different kind of emotion, right? This idea we got to protect these sort of, the pure American spirit, sort of personified as a virtuous woman. Although I especially like this one here. Gee, I wish I were a man. I'd join the Navy. Be a man and do it. Join the United States Navy. Again, seems dumb. Probably convinced at least some people to sign up for the Navy, though. Of course, buying bonds back then was a big effort, a big part of this as well. Providing financial support to the government for the war effort. And again, I mean, it's propaganda like this is fairly common. I believe the term propaganda is coined basically around this period of time. I mean, I don't think prior to this. And again, up until this point in time, I don't think the American public had ever been hit with such a massive amount of propaganda. I mean, largely owing to the fact that, this is a war, and there have been other wars in American history, the Civil War, obviously, and things like that. Although not many. And but I think more so, the sort of increasing, capability for technology to spread things. I mean, you had movies during this period of time. Mm-hmm. You had George M. Cohan, who's making these, hyper patriotic plays, and would later be portrayed by James Cagney in the movie Yankee Doodle Dandy from the 1940s, during another sort of, massive propaganda effort to build support for the war during World War II. But that's one thing that historians usually, focus on during this conflict is that the sort of massive propaganda efforts leading up to the American involvement in World War I was without precedent, up to this period of time. Since then, of course, it's become fairly, like normal now. But this was sort of a new thing to have this sort of immense, propaganda. Probably, I would say probably exceeding even what you may have seen during the Civil War. I think you could make that argument. And it's a funny thing because some people kind of seem to miss the point of that. So this is a more modern image. Now these are taking actual World War I propaganda posters and obviously refashioning them to show people wearing a mask during COVID. Now I don't know what the point is of this. I mean, like I don't know the intention of the person who made these things. Are they a conservative person who's against wearing masks and sort of making that comparison? Because if they're a liberal person, and they're trying to use this in a sort of positive way to encourage people to wear masks, I think they're very much missing the point. I mean, like the propaganda, and I say this because I could really see people doing this, but I mean, I could see people drastically misinterpreting the propaganda of World War I as some kind of moment of great national unity and people coming together and patriotism and kind of almost like celebrating it. Whereas in reality, of course, the propaganda efforts during World War I was just not something that should be celebrated. I mean, it represented the vast mass manipulation of the public. Again, essentially brainwashing the public to supporting a war which they really had no interest in. I mean, what interest did America have in fighting the war? Really none, other than the fact that again, American bankers had loaned billions of dollars to the Allies. So I don't know. I could see people doing that though. Actually, like almost like celebrating this, like, oh, remember when people came together and were unified during World War I? Well, why can't we just do that now? And everyone put a mask on. I could see a liberal person in the U.S. drastically misrepresenting that. But anyway, the crackdown on immigration during this period of time was very much a real thing. And after the war, immigration quotas would go into effect. And basically last pretty much until the late 1960s. So what you see here is basically, a graph of both the numbers of immigrants in the country as well as the percentage of the population made up by immigrants. And that's why I like this, because it gives you two different ways of measuring this. So you can see, from 1900 to about 1920, the number of immigrants were increasing in the United States. At its high point in 1910, making up almost 15% of the population, still a very small amount of the population overall, but somewhat increasing. But you see, after 1920, when the immigration quotas go into effect, you see very quickly both, the percentage of immigrants within the United States drops very quickly, and real numbers, the number of immigrants living in the United States falls to basically a low point in 1970, where you have less than 10 million immigrants in the United States, making up less than 5% of the population. When the immigration quotas are lifted in the late 1960s, you then of course see the numbers increasing again. Now this is this was from 2014, so it's a little bit outdated. But like I said, I like it because it shows you both the share of the population as well as the real numbers. But you can see again, even though the numbers of immigrants, in 2014 are over 40 million people, still make up, only about 13% of the population. So actually less of a share of the population than you had in 1910. And of course, that's because, the population as a whole has grown more, obviously, drastically since the beginning of the 20th century. Anyway, but I mean, this shows you what effect these laws have. Both create, a legislative act to create the quotas, and a legislative act to remove the quotas as well. It had a great impact on the the fluctuations of immigrants coming into the United States during this period of time. Now, the immigrant quotas of the 1920s really sort of build on a sort of growing xenophobic stance that you can see in American law. And it really, in many ways, sort of stems from the first generally acknowledged attempt to limit immigration, through legislation. In the United States, dates back to the Chinese Exclusion Act of the 1880s, I think 1882 or 1881. Where basically, we're not going to let any more Chinese people come into the United States. And of course, prior to that, there had been a great influx of Chinese immigrants coming into the United States. And of course, I think it's pretty commonly known that Chinese laborers helped build the railroads within the United States, prior to this period of time. And this is a famous, image, the meeting of two rail lines. God, I forgot the names. I think one's the Union Pacific, and I forget the name of the other one. But there were competing rail lines being built throughout the United States, and they sort of converge at this point in the 1870s. Like I said, fairly famous image. Can you see any Chinese people in this image though? It might be hard to see, but if you look closely, you will not see any. And of course, this is because these are the politicians, these are the railroad bosses, these are the white workers that are there, the union bosses and things like that. Such that they existed back then. You don't see any Chinese people, even though, of course, Chinese workers helped build these railroads. When the time came for the big photo op, I wish I could remember the name of the other rail. That kind of bothers me. The Union Pacific, is it Western Pacific or something like that? I don't know. Someone can check that though. But when the time comes for the big photo op, the people who actually helped build the railroads, and I'm not saying that it was all done by Chinese laborers, of course, but they played a great role in this, are nowhere to be seen. And of course, they did exist, and there is photographic evidence, of course, that exists of these Chinese workers. You can see some examples of that here. But for their efforts to build the railroads in America, which is enormously important in the history of the country, obviously, once that was done, once that was more or less completed, you have this. Let's get these people the hell out of here. And you can see that this is actually the one example of the magic washer. Is actually an advertisement, I think, for laundry detergent. And it says, don't use this if you want to be dirty. The Chinese must go. If you can see the small print at the bottom, we have no use for them since we got this wonderful washer. Of course, the stereotypical image of Chinese immigrants back then, besides building the railroads, was the running laundromats and things like that. What a blessing, tired mothers. It costs so little, and don't injure the clothes. So again, we don't need Chinese people to wash our clothes anymore. We can do it ourselves using the new magic washer. And you see this other advertisement, hip hooray, Chinese excluded. The Democratic Chinese exclusion bill has been signed by our Democratic president. Hip hurrah, the white man is on top. Let every Democrat and all their good citizens turn out and ratify this democratic measure. I mean, these things are quite startling, obviously, but you see how overt and obvious, racism was in this country during this period of time, and for a long period of time afterwards. How blatant it was. So here are some quotes from Bourne. Like I said, I want to keep this kind of short, so I will post a written lecture, which I believe has all the same quotes. But I'll just read. I think I just have this one quote in the slide, so I'll read it real quick because I think it more or less sums up what Bourne is trying to say. So he says, to face the fact that our aliens are already strong enough to take a share in the direction of their own destiny, and that the strong cultural movements represented by the foreign press, schools, and colonies are a challenge to our facile attempts, is not, however, to admit the failure of Americanization. So what Bourne is basically saying is that attempts to assimilate people into Americanization or to Americanize people has been a massive failure. What we're trying to do is sort of strip their culture, strip their identity from them, replace it with, again, this sort of bland, puritanical culture, which is I mean, most people who even descend from the Puritans hardly live by those kinds of Puritan values at this period of time anyway. I mean, this is where capitalism is in full swing, great fortunes are being made, there's great inequality that exists within the country. So it's all kind of hollow and hypocritical anyway. It is not to fear the failure of democracy. It is rather to urge us to an investigation of what Americanism may rightly mean. It is to ask ourselves whether our ideal has been broad or narrow, whether perhaps the time has not come to assert a higher ideal than the melting pot. Of course, the melting pot being this great metaphor that we often hear about, the United States. People often say, right, we are a nation of immigrants, we're a melting pot, meaning we all melt together, basically. And what Bourne is saying, and it's kind of interesting, challenge to this idea of the melting pot, is that the melting pot, it's kind of not a good idea. Like, we shouldn't just, this idea of melting together means that we're, again, we sort of lose what's distinctive about ourselves. We sort of turn into this, homogenous mass that's, again, sort of bland and sterile and lacking in any kind of distinctive quality. Interesting, because again, that metaphor is still often used. Surely we cannot be certain of our spiritual The democracy, when claiming to melt the nations within us to a comprehension of our free and democratic institutions, we fly into panic at the first sign of our own will and tendency. We act as if we wanted Americanization to take place only on our own terms and not by the consent of the governed. All our elaborate machinery of settlement and school and union of social and political naturalization, however, will move with friction just insofar as it neglects to take into account the strong and virile insistence that America shall be what the immigrant will have a hand in making it, not what a ruling class descendant of those British stocks, which were the first permanent immigrants, decide that America shall be made. This is the condition which confronts us and which demands a clear and general readjustment of our attitude and our ideal. So again, Bourne's ideal is, again, that, rather than trying to, make people conform to this sort of bland, and ultimately kind of, empty notion of American culture, that we should tolerate and encourage people to preserve their own distinctive ethnic cultures. And I would say, to a large extent, America has become much more like that, certainly since this period of time. Notwithstanding, attempts, mostly by people on the right to sort of, impose this kind of, I guess what would today be referred to as a kind of, white nationalism on the rest of the culture, and again, crack down very hardly upon people from outside of that. But I think the U.S. has certainly made strides in that regard, much more open to different cultures today. And I think much for the benefit of American culture. I mean, I would be one of those people who would say that to what extent American values exist. I mean, what didn't come from some other country? Even our founding political ideas, mainly came from the British. We arguably implemented them better or worse, depending upon who you ask. But I would definitely be of the view that most of what we call American culture is just kind of just this sort of like mishmash of different cultures. A large part of it comes from African Americans, particularly in popular culture, popular music, and things like that. And that's another ironic point is that especially today, but probably even back then as well. I mean, the most sort of vital aspects of American culture are not created by white middle class people living in the suburbs and things like that. I mean, it's created by people of different cultural backgrounds, of different racial and ethnic backgrounds. And it's usually not being created in the suburbs either. It's usually, in the great, American metropolises and things like that. So there's a further irony to that as well, is that the best things, there's this attempt again to sort of impose this sort of dominant white nationalistic culture or puritanical values upon people and things like that. And those are probably the least desirable aspects of American culture. And even worse, like I said, I mean, to a large extent, I mean, the idea that anyone lives according to Puritan values today is kind of absurd. I mean, if anything, American culture is just this kind of empty consumerism, just eating junk food and watching TV basically and stuff like that. And again, going on your iPhone and things like that. So Bourne, I think correctly makes the argument that the country would actually be stronger to the extent that we're more tolerant of different cultures, that we sort of, encourage the flourishing of different cultures rather than just trying to impose one kind of, dominant culture on them. And Chesterton says more or less the same thing, although he's looking at it from a different point of view. And again, I want to kind of wrap things up. So I'll rely, I quote both writers fairly extensively in the written lecture. And of course you have access to the readings themselves. But Chesterton makes an interesting point. So he's sort of coming through the immigration office, or rather he's trying to get his visa to come into the United States. Again, he's not an American, and he's asked all these odd questions on his visa form. Are you an anarchist? Are you trying to overthrow the government of the United States and things like that? And at first he's like, this is kind of a dumb idea. Like, why would they ask questions like this? By the way, if you look at a contemporary visa application form, they still ask questions like that. They'll ask you, are you a part of a terrorist organization? Do you plan on doing any suicide bombings anytime soon, or anything like that? So not much has changed in that regard. But Chesterton, says, well, when you get over the initial reaction to how dumb that sounds, you realize that the reason why they're asking all these questions is because America, at least, again, relative to other countries in Europe, I mean, even today, in fact, I would argue that, America probably has a better track record of immigration. And that's, again, not withstanding the very real issues that we see in this country. But, relative to Europe, I would still say that America probably is better when it comes to being open to immigrants from other countries. Chesterton realized that that's a big part of the sort of American political project, and he finds this in the Constitution and in the Declaration of Independence. Again, I mean, I'm sort of taking this out of context, but I'm assuming people have read this. He also says that, at first glance, the American Constitution seems quite intolerant. It seems almost like the Spanish Inquisition, which was this infamous, court that tried, so-called heretics, people who didn't have the correct Orthodox beliefs in the Catholic Church, could be tried for crimes, basically, for not having the proper beliefs. And he's saying that superficially, it almost seems like that you could almost be sort of, held culpable of something if you don't have the proper beliefs. But then he kind of comes up with a different take on it. And he says this, he says that the American Constitution does resemble the Spanish Inquisition in this, that it is founded on a creed. America is the only nation in the world that is founded on a creed. That creed is set forth with dogmatic and even theological lucidity in the Declaration of Independence, which of course, by the way, we'll be covering next class. So it's a good sort of segue into that as well. Perhaps the only piece of practical politics that is also theoretical politics and also great literature. It enunciates that all men are equal in their claim to justice. The governments exist to give them that justice, and that their authority is for that reason just. In other words, what we'd call, the consent of the governed. It certainly does condemn anarchism, and also does, by inference, condemn atheism. That was another question that he's asked. Since it clearly names the Creator as the ultimate authority from whom these equal rights are derived. Now, Chesterton actually was a religious person, so he does probably place a great emphasis on that than many other people would. He was a Catholic in Britain, which is kind of rare. Britain's, a Protestant majority country, but he was one of the, minority of Catholics that were there, and apparently had fairly, devout beliefs as well. But certainly a very, idiosyncratic thinker. Definitely hard to categorize, I guess you would say. Nobody expects a modern political system to proceed logically in the application of such dogmas, and in the matter of God and government, is naturally God, whose claim is taken more lightly. The point is that there is a creed, if not about divine, at least about human things. So I think, again, what the essential point that Bourne and Chesterton are both making is that the greatness of the American republic is its openness, is its ability to sort of, assimilate vast amounts of people from different backgrounds. I mean, certainly in Chesterton's day, I think that's still true today, the national culture was in European states and in other states as well, was very much, defined along ethnic lines. If you were a part of France, that means you were French. If you were Japanese, if you were living in Japan, it meant that you were basically a Japanese person. I'm not saying there weren't any immigrant groups in these countries. Actually, there's a very long history of sort of, Japanese marginalization of, Korean immigrants, for example, coming into Japan. Again, and the common story of immigrants coming to these countries is usually to provide a source of cheap labor, although you do see skilled workers coming in also. But that's another issue, which I won't go into right now. But that's essentially their argument, is that the greatness of this country is not, because it rigidly and dogmatically imposes a dominant set of cultural values upon people, but because it's open and it's adaptable and flexible and things like that. And that, again, he even says, this is kind of the ideal. I'm not saying that this actually exists in reality, Chesterton is saying. And it's ironic that he's saying this basically around the same period of time that the United States does introduce these immigration quotas, but at least provides a sort of different kind of cultural ideal, a sort of goal for the country to strive towards, rather than just sort of, desperately trying to preserve some kind of dominant, ethnic culture. which in this case would be, derived from the Puritan, the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, and things like that. And again, I would say this is still very much relevant now. I mean, you definitely see, although a lot of progress has been made, but you see a very strong, a small but very vocal minority on the right who are still, very much animated by this kind of so-called white nationalist politics. So I would say these issues are still very, applicable now. And he talks about the idea of citizenship, which again kind of relates to the same thing. So I won't read it again. But again, just this idea that the citizenship is broad enough that's not defined purely along ethnic lines. And so I think that's important. And I'll sort of, I think, end things here. I was serious. I won't go through all of them now, but you'll have access to the PowerPoint. Different artists who are kind of, in some ways sort of poking fun of American culture, but I think also sort of, I mean, maybe not in this example, but sort of, embracing some of the more sort of so-called lowbrow aspects of American culture. This is a famous illustration by the underground artist Robert Crumb, The Story of America, as you can see, unfolding throughout history. I like this because I like history a lot, and it says a lot, in just a few panels basically, and it sort of speaks to this idea of like this sort of arrogance and sense of superiority that you see from the dominant, I guess you could call it, white majority here in the United States. It so has a sense of superiority about its own culture, which you could wonder, like I said, I guess in their mind, derives from like the Puritans and things like that. But the extent to which people actually live by Puritan values today is kind of a joke, I think. And I think what Crumb is doing here is kind of, sort of knocking these people off their high horse, right? Sort of knocking them off their pedestal. You have this sense of superiority about your culture. What has your culture brought? What is the end result of that? You take this sort of pristine, beautiful landscape and sort of turn it into this urban or suburban hellhole, which you can sort of see in the progress from the first image to the last image. The menacing looking power lines, the gas stations, the big gas guzzling cars and things like that. Basically what he's saying is that this is the kind of superior culture that you're talking about. This is the kind of superior culture that needs to be preserved at all costs, that we have to sort of indoctrinate people that come into this culture, to come into this country to live according to these cultural values. I think it's kind of interesting. And some of the other artists, this is Robert Wilson. No, wait, is it Robert Wilson? Robert Williams. Robert Williams, I'm sorry. A few images from Spain. Rodriguez too was also kind of making fun of this. But I think in this, I mean, Williams is a pretty, out there guy. I mean, these are pretty, bizarre, surreal. These are actually paintings that he did as well. Williams, Crumb, these are guys who were big in well, not big, but were, they weren't big. They were part of an underground art movement, but had a great deal of influence, let's say, in the late 1960s through the 1970s. They're still around today. I think they're more or less semi-retired at this point. But again, sort of like Williams, I think more so kind of embracing, but also kind of making fun of the kind of lowbrow aspects of American culture. But either way, even if you embrace some aspects of it, I think it's a good way, again, sort of like knocking people off their high horse. Like, really, like, you really think this is like superior culture that we have to like force everyone to live to? It is kind of like, absurd and outrageous and things like that. So I'll sort of end on this note. I think it's a good way to end things here. And again, obviously, this is still an issue that we're dealing with now. So I'm looking forward to see what people have to say about this. Again, next class we'll talk about the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, as well as the Federalist Papers as well. There's another image from that as well. All right, so take care, everyone.